It was 11 o'clock on a Friday night when a black Bentley Continental GT rolled silently into the gravel lot of a small repair shop on the outskirts of Denver. The woman who stepped out wore a navy blazer, hair pinned without a single strand out of place, as though she had just walked out of a boardroom rather than the back seat of her own life unraveling. She placed the key on the front counter, said exactly one sentence, "Fix it, I'll be back," then stepped into a waiting car that carried her into the dark without a name, without a number, without a work order. Mason Cole stood alone in the fluorescent light, looking at the key, then at the car. A faint trace of hydraulic fluid had spread in a thin crescent beneath the rear axle, too deliberate, too precise to beware. In 15 years of reading broken machines, he had learned to tell the difference between what fails and what is made to fail. The woman was Giselle Hartman. The car was going to kill her, and someone had planned it for a very long time. Mason Cole was 38 years old and preferred it when people did not ask him questions. His shop, Cole's Auto, sat at the end of a county road between a tire distributor and a shuttered diner, the kind of place that made customers assume the work would be slow and the bill would be negotiated in cash. They were wrong on both counts. The interior of the shop was surgically clean. Tools hung in order of use along the left wall, wrenches graduated by size like a set of arguments arranged from least to most serious. Folded on the corner of his work table, face down, was a credential frame he had stopped looking at years ago. Beside it, a coffee mug that had gone cold at 7 in the evening. He had not noticed. When the Bentley rolled in, Mason did not move toward it with urgency. He wiped his hands, walked to the car, and circled it once the way a man circles something he already suspects. The exterior was immaculate. Not a stone chip, not a scuff along the rocker panels. Whoever owned this car had it detailed regularly, drove it carefully, and expected it to perform without question. He crouched at the rear and held his flashlight at a low angle to the undercarriage. The crescent of fluid he had spotted from across the lot was exactly where he thought it would be. He touched it with the tip of one finger. Hydraulic brake fluid, fresh, lighter than oil, with that faint chemical smell that most people confuse for engine coolant. He stood up and opened the hood. He worked for 3 hours without stopping, moving through the car in a sequence that was not the sequence of a mechanic fixing a problem but the sequence of an investigator reading a scene. He checked the obvious things first, then the less obvious, then the things that required a different kind of attention entirely. The kind that came from having spent a decade reconstructing the causes of accidents that turned out not to be accidents. By the time he reached the rear brake circuit, he had already found nothing wrong with the engine, the transmission fluid, the cooling system, or the electrical harness. The car was in excellent mechanical condition everywhere except one place. The rear brake line had been scored, not cut, scored. A single groove, drawn along the underside of the line with an instrument thin enough to leave no visible disturbance to the protective sleeve. The groove ran at a precise angle, calculated to weaken the wall of the line without severing it immediately, so that under normal driving pressure it would hold. Through a garage, through a parking lot, through city streets, and then fail completely at highway speed, when the pedal would sink to the floor and return nothing. Mason photographed it from 4 angles with his phone, then set the phone down on the hood and stood still for a moment, looking at the ceiling of the garage. He had seen this method before, not in a textbook, in a case file. He continued checking the rest of the vehicle with the same methodical patience, not because he expected to find more damage, but because leaving any part unexamined was a habit he had spent years training himself against. It was in the trunk behind the left rear quarter panel trim that he found the second thing, a small compartment, not factory, installed by someone who knew what they were doing, held a USB drive and a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the envelope was precise, slightly rushed, the kind of writing produced by someone who was calm enough to form letters clearly but moving fast enough not to press firmly. 4 words: "If I don't return, Logan Burke." Mason stared at the envelope for a long time. Then he put it and the USB drive in his breast pocket, walked to the far end of the workbench and pulled out his personal phone. Logan Burke. He had not spoken that name aloud in 4 years. Earlier that same day, on the 32nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Denver, Giselle Hartman had been sitting at the head of a conference table, listening to a presentation she already knew was wrong. The Hartman Automotive Group was valued at $2.3 billion. Her father had built it from a regional parts distributor into one of the largest independent automotive holding companies in the Mountain West. And when he died 18 months ago of a stroke at his desk, the board had watched Giselle walk into that same office with the kind of skepticism that does not bother to hide itself. She had spent those 18 months proving them wrong with the patience of someone who understood that being right too loudly was the same as being wrong. What she had not anticipated was Adrian Voss. The chief financial officer was 51 years old, silver-haired, and wore the particular smile of a man who had decided long ago that the rules were written by people less intelligent than himself. He had worked for her father for 9 years. He had given the eulogy at the funeral. And for the past 4 months, he had been systematically dismantling her ability to run her own company. Rerouting financial approvals through committees she did not chair, copying her out of correspondence she should have originated, and quietly building a coalition on the board of directors that had enough votes to call a vote of no confidence in 9 days. Giselle knew all of this. She had been documenting it at 2 a.m, alone, using a temporary account she had created under the credentials of a former IT contractor who had left the company 6 months earlier. What she had not known until that afternoon on the highway was that someone had also moved on the car. She had been driving back from a site visit when the brake pedal gave slightly, not failed, not bottomed, just gave a centimeter more travel than it should have, a softness that would have been invisible to most drivers. Giselle was not most drivers. Her father had taught her to drive in a parking lot in Albuquerque when she was 12 years old, and the first thing he told her was that a car always tells you what it is going to do before it does it. She had exited the highway at the next ramp, pulled onto a surface street, and searched the map on her phone for the nearest independent repair shop. Not a dealership, not a chain, nothing with a corporate parent that could be leaned on. Cole's Auto appeared 3 miles east. She drove there slowly, in the right lane, below 40 miles an hour. She had prepared the envelope and the USB drive 2 weeks earlier, the same night she had extracted the financial files, because she understood by then that the situation had moved past internal politics into something that did not have a clean name in company policy manuals. The name she had written on the envelope was one she had found in a case summary buried in a database of National Transportation Safety Board investigations from 4 years prior. A senior forensic engineer who had flagged a pattern of deliberate mechanical interference in high-profile automotive incidents before the investigation had been quietly closed and the engineer had resigned. She had filed the name away without knowing why. On the night she sealed the envelope, she understood why. She had not been certain the shop was his. She had not been certain of anything, but Cole's Auto was 3 miles from the highway, unaffiliated with anyone she knew, and the name on the business license matched. It was the only choice she had made in 2 weeks that existed entirely outside the reach of Adrian Voss. Mason called Logan Burke at 7:15 the following morning and said 4 words before Logan could speak. "I have something yours." There was a pause. Then Logan said, "Where are you?" He arrived at the shop 40 minutes later in a gray pickup with a cracked side mirror, looking more or less the same as Mason remembered. Broad through the shoulders, careful with his eyes, the kind of man who listened to what you said in the same way he watched an intersection before crossing it. Logan was 41 and had been a homicide detective with the Denver Police Department for a decade before leaving to work private investigations, which paid better and required less paperwork. He and Mason had met during a case 7 years ago in which a crashed delivery truck had turned out not to have crashed. They had stayed in contact, off and on, until they hadn't. Mason laid out the photographs on the workbench without preamble. Logan looked at them for a long time, tilting 2 of them toward the light. He did not ask what he was looking at. He said, "This was done on purpose." Mason said it had been done with a precision tool, probably a carbide-tipped scribe, by someone who understood brake hydraulics well enough to calibrate the failure point to a specific mileage range under highway load conditions. Logan looked up. Mason said, 80 to 120 miles at speed. It would have looked like a brake failure. Could have been anything, seal wear, thermal fatigue, Logan said, but it wasn't. Mason said no. He told Logan about the envelope and the USB drive. He told him the name written on the front. Logan was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested he was recalculating something. Then he said, "She left your name as a contact because you used to work NTSB." It was not a question. Mason confirmed it. He had spent 11 years as a senior forensic engineer with the National Transportation Safety Board before resigning 4 years ago after a case investigation had been blocked from above. A series of incidents involving vehicles registered to holding companies that, as Mason had eventually documented, shared a common financial parent. The documentation had gone nowhere. The investigation had been closed for procedural reasons that Mason did not believe were procedural. He had submitted his resignation, driven back to Denver, and opened a repair shop, because the thing he was best at was understanding how machines worked, and he had not yet figured out how to stop needing to do that. Logan asked whether they had opened the USB. Mason said no. He had photographed the envelope, photographed the USB drive, noted the chain of custody in a document he had started on his phone at 3 in the morning, and left both items sealed. Logan gave him a look. Mason said, "They belong to her." Logan said, "We can't reach her without going through the company." Mason said, "I know." They both knew what that meant. Every communications channel into the Hartman Automotive Group ran through a corporate infrastructure that Adrian Voss had spent months tightening his grip around. A call to the executive office would be logged, routed, and noted. They needed Giselle Hartman to come back on her own. She arrived that afternoon at 2:30, in jeans and a leather jacket, hair down, moving with the deliberate casualness of someone who had dressed to be unrecognizable and was not quite managing it. She was not alone. Beside her was a younger woman, compact and watchful, who Mason identified as personal staff before either of them spoke. He had confirmed Giselle's identity the previous night from a photograph in a business publication retrieved from a 3-year-old industry article. He had not told Logan over the phone, only said to be at the shop by noon. Logan was in the back office when the two women walked in. Giselle looked at the Bentley still on the lift and then looked at Mason. She said she was there to pick up her car. Mason said the car was not ready. She said she had not specified repairs, only asked for a service check and she would take it as is. Mason said that was not going to be possible and placed his phone on the counter with the photographs of the brake line already visible on the screen. He said, "The rear hydraulic line was scored with a precision instrument. If this car had been driven at highway speed for another 60 to 80 miles, you would have lost all rear braking at the worst possible moment. You would not have had time to react." He said it without inflection, the way a man states a measurement rather than delivers news. Giselle did not look away from the photographs. The woman beside her, Charlotte Reed, as Mason would learn, leaned in and went pale. Giselle looked up at Mason. She was not afraid, which he noted. She was calculating, which he recognized. She asked how he knew what the scoring method indicated. He held her gaze for a moment, then reached into the drawer beneath the counter and set the envelope and the USB drive on the counter between them. He said, "I didn't open either of them. They're yours." Giselle looked at the envelope. The faintest change moved through her expression. Not relief, not grief, something between the two that didn't have a common name. She picked it up and held it with both hands. She asked Mason who he was. He told her his name. She said, "That's not what I asked," and he understood then that she had already known it before she drove her car into his lot. Logan came out of the back office and the four of them sat in the shop, 2 folding chairs, a stool, a workbench edge, while Giselle opened the envelope and spread its contents across the cleared surface of the work table. The documents were printed on plain paper, a scanned contract transferring $40 million in company assets to a holding vehicle she did not recognize, bearing her signature in a form she had never seen. Beneath it, a series of internal emails between Adrian Voss and Xavier Holt, the company's general counsel, discussing the timeline for what they referred to in writing as the leadership transition. A phrase used with the confidence of people who believe no one will ever read what they have written. The USB drive held the extracted accounting files, balance sheets, wire transfer records, vendor payment approvals, each one a fragment of a pattern that assembled correctly, showed a systematic and long-running misappropriation of company funds routed through shell entities that Giselle had not known existed. Logan looked at the wire transfer records for a long time. He said the numbers were consistent with what was needed to fund a hostile acquisition. Not a hostile acquisition of a competitor, but of the company itself. If Giselle were removed from the board, criminally charged, and publicly discredited in the same week, the share price of Hartman Automotive Group would drop to a level at which a well-positioned buyer could acquire a controlling stake in the distress window before the market corrected. He asked whether Giselle knew of any external party that had expressed acquisition interest in the past year. She said there had been a quiet approach 9 months ago through an intermediary she had declined to meet. She had not learned who was behind it. She had assumed it was opportunistic. Logan wrote something down and said, "It wasn't." Mason was looking at the USB drive. He asked Giselle to confirm how she had extracted the accounting files, what account, what access, what timestamp. She told him a temporary contractor credential she had activated under her own administrative override at 2:17 in the morning from her personal laptop on the company's VPN. Mason set the USB drive down carefully and said, "That chain of custody won't hold in court. The access method was unauthorized regardless of whether you own the company. A competent defense attorney would have it suppressed in the first hearing. Giselle said she knew that. She had prepared it as insurance, not evidence. She looked at Mason, but you said you know how to make it usable. He had not said that exactly. But he had left the door open, and she had walked through it with precision, which told him something about how she thought. He turned and walked to the far corner of the workbench. The credential frame had been lying face down for 4 years. He picked it up and set it upright against the wall, and then he brought it to the table. National Transportation Safety Board, Senior Forensic Engineer. The certification was still valid. He had renewed it every 2 years out of a habit he had not been willing to examine. He said, a forensic examination of the vehicle itself conducted under federal evidentiary standards with photographic documentation, third-party verification, and a signed chain of custody beginning from the moment the car entered this lot, that's admissible. That's a foundation. He put the frame down. The financial records are secondary. What I can give you is the physical evidence. The rest depends on what Logan can file and with whom. Logan was already on his phone. They worked through the night. Mason returned to the Bentley and began the formal documentation process. Not the mechanic's notes he had made the previous evening, but the structured forensic record required for federal evidentiary use. Each photograph time-stamped and captioned, each measurement notated with instrument type and calibration date, each observation cross-referenced against NTSB technical bulletins for deliberate mechanical interference. He worked under the lift for 2 hours, then above the engine bay, then through the interior, then back to the brake line with a second set of photographs taken under different lighting conditions. By 1 in the morning he had 47 photographs, a 14-page typed report, and a signed statement from a former NTSB colleague in Salt Lake City who had reviewed the photograph remotely, recognized the scoring method, and agreed to provide a notarized technical affirmation by morning. Giselle worked at the other end of the shop on a borrowed laptop, reconstructing the financial timeline without the contested files. Using only documents she had received through official channels, emails that existed in her sent folder, meeting minutes that had been distributed to all board members, and calendar records that placed Adrian Voss and Xavier Holt in specific locations at specific times that aligned with the movement of the fraudulent transfer documents. Charlotte, who had been asked to turn off her phone after Mason noticed she had received 3 calls from a number tagged as company IT support after 9 in the evening, sat beside her and worked from memory, listing every internal communication she had handled or observed in the past 60 days. At some point after midnight, when Charlotte had been sent to rest on the back office couch and Logan had stepped outside to make calls, Mason poured 2 cups of coffee and set one near Giselle's elbow without saying anything. She picked it up without looking at him. Several minutes passed. She said, "You left the agency because of a case they shut down." He confirmed it. She said, "The company you were investigating, I found a reference to it in a tangential note in a regulatory filing. That's how I found your name." He said he figured it had been something like that. She asked whether he regretted leaving. He thought about it in the real way, not the polite way, before answering. He said, "I got the right answer on that case. I just couldn't deliver it to anyone who was willing to hold it." He drank his coffee. "Here I can do the work without someone above me deciding what it's for." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The company they were protecting then. Do you think it connects to this?" Mason looked at the space above the workbench where the credential frame now stood upright. He said he had been wondering that since 1 in the morning the previous night. He did not say more than that, because he did not yet have the evidence to say more, and he had learned a long time ago that naming a thing before you can prove it is the fastest way to make the thing disappear. Logan came back inside at 2:45 and said he had spoken to a contact at the FBI field office in Denver. Not a formal approach, not a filed complaint, a conversation. The contact had told him that a flag already existed on Adrian Voss's name in connection with a securities inquiry that had been opened 6 weeks ago and stalled for lack of a primary complainant. Logan's call had not been the first thread. It had been the one that made the pattern visible. His contact had asked for documentation. Logan said they had documentation. His contact said bring it in the morning. The night after Logan left, Charlotte discovered the tracking application on her phone, a corporate monitoring tool pushed to her device through the company's mobile device management system, which she had not disabled when she stopped using her company-issued handset. She notified Mason at 6 in the morning. He looked at the log and calculated the approximate window during which their location had been actively transmitted. Giselle's jaw tightened when she heard this, but she did not panic. She asked how much time they had. Mason said, "Enough if we move now." He said it calmly because it was true, and because the only useful thing about the kind of pressure that had just increased was that it clarified what mattered and what did not. Xavier Holt arrived at Cole's Auto at 8:47 that morning. He came with two men Mason did not recognize, both wearing the particular kind of casual clothing that is chosen to avoid looking like uniforms and achieves the opposite effect. Xavier was tall and wore round glasses and spoke in the measured cadences of a man who had spent 30 years understanding that language was a form of force. He said there was a company matter requiring Giselle's presence at the executive office. He said it with the courtesy of a person who believes the person being spoken to has no options. He looked at Mason once, briefly, the way a person looks at furniture that has been rearranged. Mason set down the wrench he was holding. He wiped his hands on a shop rag. He walked to the center of the garage floor and said, in the same tone he used to explain what was wrong with a carburetor, "You're standing in my place of business. I completed a forensic examination of the vehicle on this lift at 6:45 this morning. The report was sent to the FBI field office at Denver at 6:50. A copy was filed with the NTSB regional office as a notification of suspected deliberate mechanical interference under federal statute." He looked at Xavier without raising his voice. "The physical evidence is logged, photographed, signed, and in 3 different hands that aren't mine. You're welcome to stay, but I'd think carefully about why you came." Xavier looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Giselle. Then he looked at Charlotte. He said to no one in particular, "This is a private matter." Mason said, "It stopped being private when someone put a score mark in a brake line." Xavier adjusted his glasses. The 2 men behind him shifted weight. And then Xavier Holt, general counsel of the Hartman Automotive Group, turned and walked back out through the bay door with the 2 men behind him, and got into a car and drove away without another word. Giselle looked at Mason. She asked, "Did you actually send it at 6:50? He picked the wrench back up and returned to the workbench. "Yes," he said. The board of directors of the Hartman Automotive Group convened in an emergency session 48 hours later in a room on the 32nd floor of the tower downtown. The session had been called by Adrian Voss, who had managed in less than 24 hours to collect enough board signatures to accelerate the vote of no confidence to an emergency timeline, citing concerns about executive stability and fiduciary responsibility. 6 of the 11 board members had already received private briefings from Adrian and Xavier in the days prior. The brokerage of those votes had been conducted with the polished efficiency of people who had been planning the timing for a long time. Giselle walked into the room alone. Charlotte was in the building but not in the room. Mason and Logan were in the lobby below, Logan with a phone that was receiving updates from the FBI contact every 15 minutes. Giselle set a laptop on the conference table, sat down, and waited while the remaining board members filed in. Adrian arrived last, unhurried, and took his seat at the far end of the table. He had the ease of a man who believes the outcome of a meeting has already been arranged. The session opened with formalities that no one in the room cared about. Adrian then presented his materials. The forged transfer contract, printed and bound, distributed to each board member on cream-colored paper with the company's watermark. He walked through the alleged timeline of the transfers in the language of careful concern, the language of a man reluctantly protecting an institution from someone he had once trusted. 2 board members nodded. One asked a clarifying question. The air in the room had the specific quality of something that has been rehearsed. When Adrian finished, he looked at Giselle and offered her the floor with the gesture of a person extending a courtesy they know will not change anything. Giselle opened her laptop. She said she had 3 things to show them and she would not take long. The first was a 14-page forensic report, produced under federal evidentiary standards, documenting deliberate mechanical interference with the brake hydraulics of her personal vehicle, a vehicle last serviced at a company-authorized dealership 11 days prior. The report bore the signature of a credentialed NTSB-affiliated forensic engineer and had been filed with the FBI field office at Denver. She displayed the filing confirmation on the screen. Several board members shifted in their chairs. The second item was a series of internal emails between Adrian Voss and Xavier Holt, authenticated by their original server metadata, discussing the timeline and mechanism of what they had called the leadership transition. She displayed 3 exchanges on the screen, each dated, each attributable by IP address and login credential to the senders. She did not read them aloud. She let the board read them in silence. The room became very quiet in the way, Rooms become quiet when the people in them are reassessing something they thought they understood. The third item was a filing confirmation from the Securities and Exchange Commission, received that morning, acknowledging receipt of a formal complaint regarding suspected securities fraud and undisclosed conflicts of interest in connection with potential acquisition activity targeting Hartman Automotive Group. The investigation was open. It had a case number. Adrian Voss stood. He began to speak in the measured, controlled register of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and knows how to move through them. He said the forensic report was prepared by a private individual with no current federal standing. He said the emails were taken out of context. He said the SEC filing was a harassment tactic by a hostile party. He was articulate and he was composed, and he was approximately 3 sentences into his argument when the door of the conference room opened and Logan Burke walked in with a woman Mason's NTSB contact had arranged. An active FBI special agent holding a federal subpoena for Xavier Holt to appear as a material witness in an ongoing securities and wire fraud investigation. Xavier Holt stood up from his chair and walked out of the room with the agent without speaking to anyone. Adrian stopped talking. The room was silent. He stood at the end of the table with his hands resting on the surface, and he looked at Giselle with an expression that had shed everything, the courtesy, the calculation, the particular smile, and was left with something that might have been genuine curiosity. He asked her, quietly, "Where did you find him?" Giselle closed her laptop. She said nothing. She did not need to. The vote of no confidence was called. 4 board members voted in favor. 7 voted against. Giselle Hartman remained Chief Executive Officer of the Hartman Automotive Group. The meeting was adjourned at 2:17 in the afternoon. In the days that followed, the weight of the thing settled unevenly across the people who had been inside it. Adrian Voss and Xavier Holt were formally charged within the week, 9 counts between them covering wire fraud, securities manipulation, conspiracy to commit bodily harm, and filing of falsified corporate instruments. The foreign investment fund whose acquisition strategy had depended on Giselle's removal became the subject of a separate investigation that the FBI indicated would take months and would reach further than Denver. The board reconstituted its audit committee under independent oversight and authorized a full forensic accounting review of every transaction handled by the CFO's office in the prior 24 months. Charlotte Reed had her corporate device replaced, her credentials fully restored, and a written apology from the board's chairman delivered in person. She accepted it without comment and returned to her desk. Logan Burke filed his consulting invoice and went back to work. Before he left the shop on the day of the board meeting, he pulled Mason aside and told him that the investment funds network had a subsidiary that appeared in 3 of the case files from the investigation Mason had been blocked from completing 4 years ago. He said the FBI agent they had worked with was aware. He said Mason might be getting a call. Mason said he had figured it might go that way. Logan said, "Does that change anything for you?" Mason thought about it. "Probably," he said, which was as close to yes as Logan had ever heard him come. 1 week after the board session, on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, when the light came in at a long angle through the open bay doors of Cole's Auto, the black Bentley Continental GT rolled back into the lot. Mason was under a different vehicle and heard the tires on the gravel and knew the weight of it before he saw it. He came out from under the lift and stood up, wiping his hands. The car was repaired. Had been repaired the day after the board meeting, every component checked and certified, the brake line replaced with a new assembly, and the entire hydraulic circuit bled and pressure tested. He had parked it in the lot with the key on the hood and not called anyone. Giselle stepped out. She was in a dark coat, hair down, and she stood for a moment looking at the car the way a person looks at something they had thought they might not see again. Then she walked into the shop. Mason was at the workbench, facing away. She said his name once. He turned around. She placed 2 envelopes on the workbench surface. The first was the payment for the service, the full forensic work, the repair, the certification, everything. The figure was written out in the amount she judged it to be worth, which was considerably more than he would have charged. The second envelope was a letter on Hartman Automotive Group letterhead describing a consulting engagement, an independent safety verification program for the company's fleet management operations, reporting directly to the CEO's office, retainer-based, structured so that Mason would remain independent and unaffiliated with any corporate entity below the executive level. He looked at both envelopes without picking them up. He asked why him specifically, rather than a full-service firm. She said because a full-service firm would have a parent company and a managing partner and a liability insurer, and 3 reasons to stop at whatever line they were told not to cross. He picked up the second envelope and turned it over in his hands without opening it. He said, "Let me think about it." She said, "I know." She was already turning back toward the car. He stood in the doorway of the bay and watched her pull out onto the county road and drive east until the car was gone. The shop was quiet in the way it always was. The hum of the compressor, the dry smell of clean concrete, the afternoon light across the tools on the wall. His phone rang. "Logan," he answered. Logan said, "That thing I told you about the fund subsidiary. The FBI wants a formal interview. They want it next week in Washington. They're treating the case from 4 years ago as an active file." There was a pause on the line. "You willing to go?" Mason looked at the workbench. The credential frame stood upright against the wall where it had been since the night Giselle Hartman walked out of his shop with a key and a plan she hadn't fully explained to anyone. He looked at his hands. He looked at the frame. He said, "Send me the address."